Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Well, greetings. Welcome to Resuming Debate. I'm your host, Member of Parliament, Garnet Jennis. So very often on this podcast, of course, we're discussing political issues, especially Canadian politics, and as they relate to my work as a parliamentarian. But as a sort of side hobby, but not entirely a side hobby, I love reading history and studying history. Those of you who hear me speak on the podcast and elsewhere will know that. And I also think learning about history is hugely important to our practice of politics today. We recently had an episode that was very well received on the history of the anti-Nazi German resistance. And I think we were able to both share some of that history and the inspiration that comes from that, but also talk about some of the contemporary relevance of that. So today I am so excited about the fact that we have really a globally renowned author of history. Giles Milton has written 12 works of history. They've been translated into 25 languages. And I think over 1 million copies of his books sold in the UK alone. Giles, it's great to have you on for a discussion about one of your books, but maybe we'll get to touch on some of your other work as well. Giles, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me on. Delighted to be here.
Excellent. So I'm part of a kind of history book club that has a lot of kind of political people, and the first book we read was your book, Winston Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and I think it's a fantastic book. I would say for those who don't read a lot of history books, it's a great narrative. It's a good one for people to sort of take a step into reading about history. It's a fun book. And I think it's a very relevant one. So actually, before that'll be the focus of our discussion. But before we started, you had mentioned your latest book is out, which I unfortunately haven't read, but I will read. It's called Checkmate in Berlin. I wonder if you could just tell folks a bit about Checkmate in Berlin before we get to the main discussion.
Sure, yeah. So many hundreds of books are written and published each year about the Second World War, but almost nothing is published about the immediate aftermath of the war, the first 4 or 5 years after the war's end, when really the shape of Europe and the shape of the modern world was forged in these 4 years. And what's fascinating about Berlin is that the city, of course, was split into 4 sectors: Russian, French, British, and American. And this became a battleground, really, between the West and the Soviet Union, which until very recently had been an ally of the West, of the Western allies. So we had this great battle taking place. And I tried to tell the story through the personalities of the 4 commandants of the 4 sectors, because their personal fallout, certainly the fallout between the Western commanders and their Soviet counterpart, which really mirrors the fallout that was taking place on a global scale. And so I'm able to tell this story through these very powerful personalities as the world really divides and splits irrevocably into 2 opposing camps. So really, this is the beginning of the Cold War. And also, of course, the book ends with the formation of NATO, which is much in discussion in the news at the moment. But it's an absolute key moment in global security, in the forging of post-war Europe, and of course, in the beginnings of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. It seems to be a characteristic of a good history book that you're able to tell these stories of these individuals and their motivations and their character and link that to larger events with the sense that that personalities do matter, right? That the people involved do shape events, and events could be different if the relationships play out in a different way, right?
Absolutely. And I think with Checkmate in Berlin, the key character in the book is the American Commandant, the Commandant of the American sector of Berlin. He was called Colonel Frank Howling Mad Howley, a fantastic character, a real sort of cowboy who was sort of dropped into Berlin. And what's really fascinating about him is he was the first person really to realize that the Soviets were no longer allies, that they could not be trusted, that in fact, he says in his own words, he says, I came to Berlin thinking that the Germans were the enemy, but I realized almost immediately that the Soviets were now the enemy. And it was his task really was to convince Truman in America and all his chiefs of staff that actually that the Soviets were extremely dangerous, that they were intending to try and kick the Western allies out of Berlin as a prelude to taking control of the whole of Germany. So he's a pivotal character, very little known about now, but I think he played a major role, not only in saving West Berlin, but also in the structure of Western Europe following the end of the war.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, so much of our perspective of World War II is, sees it as one war of the Allies versus the Axis powers. When I think to a lot of people at the time, there was almost a sense of two wars, because what was happening with the Soviets, a very different sort of set of values represented by the Soviet regime, obviously, and represented by the Western allies. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, part Jewish. She was never captured. She was living in Germany during the war. She was not in Berlin, but I recall her saying specifically to us that they had real specific thoughts about who they hoped would be occupying the sector they were in. They were hoping for the British, actually, and they ended up in the American sector, but much better off than dealing with Soviet occupation. I guess just one final question on the Berlin book before we go to the main topic. My sense of some of that history was that the British were always more suspicious of the Soviets, and in particular, Winston Churchill was more suspicious of the Soviets than the American leadership under Roosevelt and then Truman, and maybe some of that was a question of party politics, that Roosevelt was a little bit more to the left and therefore didn't have the same sort of instinctive anti-communism that Winston Churchill did. Does that play out in your book, kind of differences in terms of British and American views of the Soviet approach?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Winston Churchill detested the Soviets. He had done ever since the Russian Revolution of 1917. And of course, he was Minister of Munitions at the end of the First World War. And he was one of his roles was to ship in as many weapons as possible to the White Armies who were fighting against the Bolshevik revolutionaries. So he had a profound mistrust. And it's really fascinating when you look at the Western alliance with Stalin. You know, they were going into an alliance with somebody they knew to be a complete monster, who'd butchered millions of people, you know, who'd been the instigator of the Great Purge. And I think that, yes, I think that Britain was more hostile. I think America was more prepared to see this as an alliance of necessity. Having said that, Churchill, you know, in his famous broadcast on the very day that the German army attacked the Soviet Union, he said, "I will not unsay anything I've said against the communist regime. However, our present, the most important goal we have at the present is to defeat Hitler. And that requires us to go into an alliance with Stalin and the Soviet Union. But it would remain a very uneasy alliance throughout the whole of the war. And I think it was probably inevitable that as soon as the war was over, that these partners were going to fall out."
If I remember right, the most poignant line from Churchill about the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was that even if Hitler invaded, the line was, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons."
That's absolutely right. He said that that very night of the invasion, or just after he'd been brought news of the invasion, he said it to his personal aide, who thought that's a cracking Churchill line and wrote it down in his diary, which is why we still know about that line.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so he said that as an aside, but we know about it. So speaking of Winston Churchill, let's talk about this book that really motivated me to want to have this conversation. Winston Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and it's this beautiful, exciting story of guerrilla warfare during the Second World War. Of it kind of bringing together two stories: one story about technological innovation, another story about people dropping in kind of behind enemy lines to engage in strategic sabotage. And I think most people who know about the history of the Second World War would have some sense of a lot of aerial bombardment. But this is kind of another way that the Allies seem very successfully to have undermined German operations. So maybe share a bit about why you seized on this particular issue and what the kind of key story is in this book.
Well, to take it back to Churchill, I mean, one of my favorite quotes from Churchill is he said, "It's not just the good boys who win wars, it's the cheats and stinkers as well." And I guess my story is really the story of those cheats and stinkers. Britain was in absolutely desperate straits in 1940. And Churchill and his ministers all knew that the Britain could not defeat Hitler in a head-to-head clash because simply the Wehrmacht was just too powerful. And so the idea was to try and think up creative ways of destroying Hitler's war machine. And it was realized from the very beginning that a highly mechanized modern war machine like Hitler's was also extremely vulnerable because it relied on infrastructure when it was rolling across Europe. It needed bridges, it needed fuel depots, it needed to use the railway lines. And so there was this idea was born that by taking out soft targets, you could actually quite easily cripple this army. You could stop it in its tracks. And so an organization was set up to plan how best to launch guerrilla attacks on the Nazi war machine to basically render it incapable of advancing and committing and continuing with its offensive in Western Europe. And so this is really the story of the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It was highly controversial at the time. The British, even the senior chiefs of staff, felt that fighting a war was a little bit like playing a game of cricket, you know, that you abided by the rules, that you didn't punch somebody when they were down. But Churchill brought on board this chap called Colin Gubbins, who's to become head of this ministry, who thought quite the opposite. He thought, actually, punching a man when he was down was a very good idea. And so he began to develop this idea, which was encapsulated in a booklet that he wrote on how to fight a thoroughly ungentlemanly war against the Nazis. He said that when you're dealing with an enemy as monstrous as Hitler, there is no room for good behavior. You do absolutely anything you can to defeat him. That could be guerrilla attacks, it could be assassination, it could be blowing up trains, taking out bridges, whatever. He was prepared to try absolutely everything.
Yeah, so it's as you just alluded to there, I mean, it's a great story. It's exciting to follow, but it also is a great jumping off point for some good discussion about questions of morality in warfare, legality, and how we kind of weigh those competing things out. To start with, it's just striking that in the midst of what was clearly such an existential struggle, there were a lot of people on the other side of that who were saying, no, this is the proper way to conduct a war, with the implication, I suppose, that even if we lose, it's better to lose to the Nazis with all that entails than to engage in tactics that are unseemly. I mean, was this the explicit view of some of the members of the British army that were opposed to this? Yeah.
You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, they're sort of encapsulated by somebody called General Sir Edward Spears, real old style general, and he was absolutely horrified when he heard what was being proposed by Colin Gubbins about fighting the Nazis. And he said, you know, we're British, we don't stoop to these tactics. And Colin Gubbins found himself really facing a wall of criticism from the British establishment, who did not want to go down this route. He, however, had the ear of Churchill. Churchill always liked the idea of taking an unconventional approach. And Colin Gubbins's ideas, they struck a chord with him. And so what was set up, what originally was known as a military intelligence unit, gradually morphed into what would become SOE, the Special Operations Executive. And this was a body whose explicit task was, as Churchill himself said, was to set Europe ablaze. Its task was to plan and undertake a thoroughly dirty war against Hitler's war machine. And like I was saying, that would include everything from blowing up senior Gestapo figures to carrying out assassinations. There was to be really no morality. And some of these operations were probably almost certainly illegal in the rules of war, but there were to be no rules of war because it was felt by Churchill and by Colin Gubbins that Hitler had torn up the rule book, and therefore they were going all out to defeat him, and they would use any tactics that they deemed necessary to do so.
So one of the thoughts I had reading your book is that there is a distinction between questions of gentlemanliness and questions of morality. So to me, questions of gentlemanliness deal with convention and process. This is the way it's been done in the past. Whereas questions of morality deal with absolute right and wrong that may come from, wherever it comes from, but questions of absolute right and wrong. And so in some cases, for instance, you talk in the book about how these acts of sabotage, unconventional, ungentlemanly, actually reduce civilian casualties. That things like aerial bombardment, which were consistent with the rules of war, would result in more loss of civilian life than the kind of sneaking around dirty war types of tactics. So it seemed to me that there actually was a tension between questions of morality and questions of gentlemanliness. And I guess personally, I very much believe in the idea of moral absolutes. And I think, but it seems that an ungentlemanly war might be a more just war, actually, if it minimizes the loss of civilian life. What are your thoughts on that distinction between gentlemanliness and morality?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point, and I used two sort of case studies, if you like. One of them was the question of the Peugeot factory in France. The Peugeot factory was the biggest industrial plant in Europe, and it had been captured by the Nazis and had been turned over to making tanks, planes, etc., for the Nazi war machine. Now, the RAF had carried out several massive aerial bombardments of this factory. The Pathfinders would fly in, they'd drop their flares around the ground, and then the wave of bombers would come in and use those flares on the ground to drop their bombs. Now, on two occasions, the Pathfinders had unfortunately dropped their flares in the wrong place, which meant that the bombers came over and dropped all their bombs onto the villages that surrounded the factory, completely obliterating these villages, whereas they entirely missed the factory itself. And Colin Gubbins was infuriated by this appalling loss of French civilian life. And he said, I can send in one man with a bag of explosives, and I could do more damage with that one man with no loss of life, no civilian casualties whatsoever, by a highly precise operation carried out by one person who would then recruit some factory workers on the ground. And this is exactly what happened. Harry Ray, an English guy who spoke fluent French, of French descent, was dropped into France with an array of explosives, built a small team of factory insiders, went in there and blew up caused a massive damage inside this factory. And like I say, with no civilian losses whatsoever. So that's a sort of interesting case where, yes, the conventional approach of dropping tons of explosives from the air was hugely costly in innocent lives, whereas this rather ungentlemanly approach, as it was seen by the British establishment, was far more effective and far more damaging ultimately to the Germans. So that's one approach. Then there was the other sort of case which also raised many questions, even amongst those working for the Special Operations Executive, was the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague. This was Hitler's right-hand man, the butcher of Prague, as he was known. And Stalin had been calling upon the Western allies to do something inside Czechoslovakia. He wanted some sort of operation carried out in Czechoslovakia. And so it was decided by SOE to try and take out Heydrich, to assassinate him. Now, this was going to be very controversial because they knew by assassinating someone as senior as Hitler's right-hand man, there were going to be reprisals. There were going to be civilians were almost certainly going to be shot as a sort of reprisal, revenge killings, if you like. And it was debated at length as to whether the ends justified the means, etc., and whether they should carry out this assassination. Ultimately, they decided it should. They decided that Heydrich was killing so many innocent civilians anyway that he deserved to be taken out, and they would live with the appalling consequences that would follow. And so they did carry out this operation. They did successfully kill him, and there were horrific civilian reprisals. So, I mean, yes, there are questions of morality. They were aware of it, but they looked at each operation they were going to carry out very carefully before doing it, because they knew that it would have consequences.
Mm-hmm. So I obviously understand the benefits of taking out supply lines and identifying soft targets. I mean, what is the strategic advantage of assassinating a senior Nazi figure who presumably would be just replaced by somebody else? What's the logic to that?
I think the logic largely was that because Stalin was demanding some sort of operation inside Czechoslovakia, the factories were producing weapons for Hitler's army, etc., etc. He actually contacted President Beneš, who was living in exile. Obviously, his government in exile was based in London. And Stalin contacted him and said, I want you to do more. I want you to do something, prove you can do something. And so Beneš and his head of his secret service, who was also based in London, they went to Colin Gubbins and to the Special Operations Executive and said, what can we do that will show Stalin, demonstrate to Stalin that we are serious? And it was SOE who came up with the idea of taking out Heydrich. It was, I think, like you say, it was sort of inevitable that Heydrich was going to be replaced by another monster. But this, I think, was in some ways it was going to assuaging to Stalin, to proving to Stalin that the Britain and the British were not impotent, standing on the sidelines, that they were prepared to get their hands dirty in this war.
Yeah. That's fascinating, kind of the overlay of the political discussions and pressures and some of the operational aspects. Let me say, on the other hand, when it comes to the question of assassinations, I mean, there in a previous podcast, we talked to an author about, in the context of the anti-Nazi German resistance, just some of the senior military leaders that were either plotting against Hitler or, after Valkyrie, working to lose the war more quickly to minimize loss of life, and doing so against Hitler's orders. So you could maybe hope that the removal of some of these hardcore committed Nazis could lead to them being replaced by softer figures who might be prepared to make interim arrangements or early surrender. So these are, I suppose, just hard calculations to make in the fog of war, right? But they're ones we have to live with. Very
difficult, and also they were incredibly risky for those undertaking them as well. I mean, the two assassins who were sent in to take out Heydrich, this was a highly dangerous operation. It was a highly complex operation as well. And this is where actually, in my book, I touch on some of the specialist weaponry that had to be developed to carry out these operations. They required bespoke weaponry that simply didn't exist. It had to be dreamed up. And this is where, within the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, you have creative geniuses, often mavericks, terribly eccentric characters, being brought on board to design weapons that would do what they were meant to do. And in the case of the assassination of Heydrich, I mean, one of my favorite characters in the book is this chap called Cecil Clarke, who's eccentric beyond belief. And he was tasked with producing a specialist grenade that would blow through the floor of an armor-plated Mercedes and kill Heydrich by the shrapnel that was going to be forced up through the car as the weapon exploded. It was a very, very difficult weapon to create, to design, to make. And it was a work of pure genius, because what happened on that day when the two assassins went to try and kill Heydrich, they threw the grenade exactly as they were meant to throw it. It exploded exactly as it was meant to under the rear wheel arch of the car, and it blew shrapnel up through the car and into Heydrich's body. And it was, of course, he died of blood poisoning a couple of days later, because what it did, it shredded the horsehair seat that he was sitting on and forced this into his body and gave him a particularly nasty death, which I think brought great pleasure to Cecil Clarke, who'd spent many months designing this weapon.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So many different places to go from that. I mean, nobody was. Just to clarify that point you just made, I mean, they weren't seeking to inflict pain so much on their enemies. They were trying to realize strategic objectives, right? Is there some sense that they were trying to bring about a grisly end for their foes?
No, I think what's fascinating about the case of Cecil Clarke, he was a pacifist. He'd had a terrible time in the First World War. Had seen such terrible things that he actually had a complete nervous breakdown at the end of the First World War. He was a pacifist. He went on to be one of the founding members of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So wow. It's sort of bizarre in a way that you have someone like him who's prepared to spend months and months designing a totally hideous weapon that's going to kill somebody. But I think that the whole purpose of SOE Special Operations was that this was an existential threat. The Nazis posed an existential threat, and any means possible could be used to bring about the end to this war, and to bring about the end to the war as quickly as possible. And so you do have these extraordinarily strange contradictions that a pacifist can be designing a weapon of pure nastiness, you know. But
is part of that maybe that he was and they were nonconformists? I mean, the same impulse that said no, we have to change the way we do warfare led them to say also we need to change the way we do diplomacy. They were prepared to be on the nuclear disarmament side, even though that was unpopular and unconventional, while also being on the anti-military establishment side during the war.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. A lot of them were certainly Mavericks. A lot of them, I think, were maybe, we'd say nowadays, they were on the spectrum, I think, which gave them odd, sort of conflicting moral views about things, I think. But it's very clear that when they came, they were tasked with bringing about the defeat of the Nazis, that they were prepared to tear up the rule book and go and try anything if that would lead to that goal, basically. Yeah.
Let's talk about, since you brought up Cecil Clarke, let's talk a bit about the weapons. One of the things that I found really fascinating is you know, everybody has a budget that you kind of have to work within, right? And this wasn't the main focus of the military. So there was this group, and they were doing a lot of kind of makeshift innovation. There's one point in the story, as I recall, I think it's Cecil Clarke goes out and buys a whole bunch of condoms, because that's you know, it's because he figured that for this particular weapon, I can't recall all the details, but for this particular weapon, they maybe a condom would just be the right thing. So maybe you could tell a little bit about that, the way that they were just you know, going to the convenience store and picking up whatever they could get their hands on, instead of having custom made products at the factory.
Yeah. So it's probably important just for your listeners to say that you have Special Operations Executive, which is planning the missions that are going to be take place overseas, and you have an organization closely affiliated with it called MD1, which was producing the bespoke weaponry that was needed to carry out these acts of sabotage. Now, MD1, it stood for Ministry of Defense 1, but there was no Ministry of Defense during the war. But there was, however, a Minister of Defense, and that was Winston Churchill. So basically, MD1 became his own personal sabotage unit. It was financed by him. The money was the sort of back channels of cash came into their bank account. And so he gave them carte blanche to develop whatever weapons they saw fit to use when carrying out their operations. So you're right, Cecil Clarke was a member of MD1. And the weapon you're talking about with was actually later became known as the Limpet Mine. And this was a work of absolute genius. It was a magnetic mine, and the original prototype was made with a metal bowl that Cecil Clarke bought from Woolworths, which is a famous convenience store in Britain at the time. A metal bowl lined with magnets, filled with plastic explosives, and with a special timer device on it, which caused it to explode. Why this was such a genius weapon really was that the Limpet Mine could be, because it was a magnetic mine, it could be used against anything made of metal. So it could be used against a ship. You have a diver would swim under the ship, slap it on the underside of the ship, it would blow up and a massive hole would be blown in the ship. It could be used on electricity turbines. It could be used on generating plants. Anything made of metal could be blown up with the Limpet Mine. The detonator, and I'm going to come on to the condoms, why he needed so many condoms. The detonator was a fascinating little device which used an aniseed ball as the timing device. The aniseed ball was released into water, and Cecil Clarke realized that an aniseed ball dissolved with perfect regularity. So you knew exactly how long it would take to dissolve, and as it dissolved, when it finally dissolved, it would trigger the bomb, and the thing would blow up basically. But there was a problem because this aniseed ball was stored in this weird sort of cylinder of water. And if this thing got damp when it was being stored, held in storage, the thing would blow up basically because the aniseed ball would start to dissolve. So Cecil Clarke realized that if you wrapped the entire thing in a condom, it kept it perfectly dry for the entire time it was in storage. So yes, you're right. He ended up going up and down his local town, going in all the local pharmacies, buying up their entire stocks of condoms. And he as he wrote in his memoir, earning myself.
That explained the baby boom afterwards.
Yes, exactly. But he also said, I earned myself a reputation for sexual prowess because he was buying up so many condoms. But anyway, it was a work of genius. It led to the destruction of huge numbers of ships. I mean, it was widely used, this Limpet Mine, and it was also used on many power stations, generating stations. And just to give you one example of how versatile and how brilliant it was, the Allies wanted to take out the Nazi U-boat, the submarine pens that they were on the west coast of France. These, of course, were the U-boats going out into the Atlantic and sinking Allied shipping. They couldn't possibly attack the pens themselves. These were massive concrete bunkers in which the U-boats were housed. So what they always did, they thought outside the box. They thought creatively. How can we cripple these U-boat pens without actually attacking them with explosives? Well, what do? It's very simple. They send in saboteurs with limpet mines into the electricity generating plant that supplies all the electricity for this huge U-boat place of storage, basically. And they take out the electricity generating plant, and the place has no power, and it's completely useless for several months, on end. And so that's the way they were always thinking, how best to basically disrupt or cripple the essential components of Hitler's war machine.
Yeah, that's a great story, and it just gives you this image of a couple guys working in their garage on things to blow up Nazi installations with. So, Giles, I want to ask about this question of the relationship to the bureaucracy. You alluded to it with your description of MD1. bureaucracies in general are famously rigid and unresponsive to proposed innovations, but the British bureaucracy in particular, with all due respect, I mean, the whole show Yes Minister has spawned out of making jokes about that. And I guess we would like to believe that during wartime, during moments of extreme crisis, let's say hypothetically a pandemic, right, that all the usual kind of bureaucratic inefficiencies and turf wars go away, and that everybody just focuses on a common goal. But that's not realistic. And your book, I think, exposes some of the bureaucratic inertia and the barriers that came up. And so you have this kind of tension between the bureaucrats and the Mavericks, and you have this way in which political leadership, Winston Churchill, is trying to create this mechanism outside of the bureaucracy. So what did you find as you're kind of digging through the research on this book about that relationship between Mavericks and the bureaucracy, and how much of an extent to which you see kind of bureaucratic mentality slowing down the work of countries during wartime?
Yeah, this is a sort of an extraordinary thing, really, that take the development of weaponry during the war. Everything the army needed, and the Air Force and the Navy needed, any weapons they needed had to go through the Ministry of Supply. And this was like a giant machine of red tape, basically, that slowed absolutely everything down. Any new weapon had to go through about 6 or 7 processes before it could be green lit. And this took up an enormous amount of time. It was ridiculous. A weapon might be needed immediately, and it would take months and months and months to pass through the hands of the bureaucrats working in the Ministry of Supply. And so this is really the raison d'etre for SOE and for MD1, the weapons development, was simply to tear up all the red tape. There was going to be no red tape whatsoever. They were charged with designing, developing, and producing the weapons. The Ministry of Supply was not even involved in any of this when it came to developing these bespoke weapons. And it meant that they were remarkably efficient. They could turn around a weapon in days, unlike the 3 or 4 months it might take if you went through the Ministry of Supply. And they could turn them around on an industrial scale. And to give you one example, they developed very early on in the war, they developed a thing called the ST grenade, or it was known as the sticky bomb. This was, there was a problem blowing up German tanks because the metal shields were so thick that conventional explosives wouldn't pass through the metal. So they had an idea, MD1, that if you could develop a weapon that would stick to the tank before it exploded, the explosive force would be massively increased. So they developed this thing became known as the sticky bomb, highly effective. And Churchill saw this in action, and he sent a memo to MD1 the next day, and it just said, I've seen it in our National Archives here, it's wonderful. It just says, sticky bomb, make 1 million. And so production was then farmed out to all sorts of factories around the country, sort of it farmed out to private factories who would then make these weapons. So it was a complete change, a revolution, if you like, in the way that weaponry was commissioned and built. And it just massively speeded up the process.
Yeah, so just to clarify that, was it a revolution in the process, or was it going outside the process? Like, did they continue to have these same issues with weapons procurement in general? They were just doing their own thing on the side?
No, I suppose, yes, you're right. It went outside the process. They simply ignored the Ministry of Supply. The Ministry of Supply carried on, throughout the war, producing their red tape for everything. Yeah. But these guys, they just, they thought outside the box, and they worked outside the box, if you like.
Did you find it incredible that there was so much red tape during an existential war like that? I mean, this is one of the themes of your book too, is just the you have the heroes that are trying to push through, but then there seem to be all these people that are saying we've got to do it the way we've always done it, notwithstanding all the things that are at stake. Like, did that surprise you personally to come upon that?
Yeah, I think the the power of the establishment and just the conservative nature of the British establishment is quite striking, really. And yes, that continues through the war. And although, you know, many of us see Churchill as the ultimate sort of establishment figure, I think he was anything but. And he was the one that was prepared to have a go, you know, at anything, basically. And it was really his initiative that drove this forward. And there's one other very important person who is one of his very closest friends, totally weird Professor Lindemann, Professor Frederick Lindemann, known by all and sundry as the Prof, very, very close to Churchill. And he was also completely supportive of this idea of thinking outside the box, of doing things in a completely different way that had hitherto been the received way of doing things. And so with Churchill's political backing, with the wherewithal of Professor Lindemann, who was able to get all the money that was needed as well for MD1, they were really able to work outside the existing systems. But it is astonishing that the Ministry of Supply and that red tape continued throughout the war.
It's interesting your comment about Churchill being perceived as traditionalist conservative figure, and yet being a real kind of reformer. I guess my instinct to look at British political history for a second is just that there is this archetype of the great kind of reforming conservative, right? Churchill, but Disraeli before him. You have the small c conservative establishment, not in the sense of necessarily that we use politically conservative, but just resistant to change. You have that, and then you have these capital C conservative figures who were really reform oriented and who made careers out of challenging received wisdom, and Disraeli, Churchill, Thatcher, in certain respects, all kind of fit into this mold. And I think we see it throughout Churchill's career, right? I mean, I'll come to it in a minute. I want to ask you about sort of World War I, and he clearly had these kinds of reforming instincts in World War I. His weak point strategy and some of the other things he proposed. Is that a good way to think about some of this tension between sort of within ostensibly what you'd call conservatism is these sort of establishment conservatism and reforming conservatism?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case for Churchill. And I mean, you see so many contradictions in his career. I mean, I like to look at the period after the First World War when he was Minister of Munitions. I mean, this was highly controversial, what he was proposing, and really driving forwards was the idea of supporting the White Armies against the Red Army, and pouring in particularly nasty munitions into Archangel and Murmansk, so that for the White Armies to do battle against the Red Armies. And this was frowned upon by many in the political establishment in Britain at the time, but Churchill drove it forwards. They were even sending British troops into the Soviet Union at the time as well. So so in some ways, it doesn't surprise me that he was pushing forwards special operations, MD1, etc. I mean, it seems in a way to follow a pattern in his career of whilst in some ways being conventional, in other ways being highly unconventional as well.
Yeah. So this has been a great discussion so far. I want to, before we get to the end, go through two additional themes in particular. I want to ask you a bit about the relationship of this period, the Second World War, to kind of prior history and in British warfare, and then also after that want to bring us up to the present and talk about speculate a little bit about how these tactics might be playing out today, especially in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. So going back to the history of, of course, the one great kind of romantic hero of the First World War was T.E. Lawrence, and he was pioneering guerrilla tactics, saying, was part of the Arab revolt that was happening. Let's not hit the Turkish army head on. Let's be like a gas floating around the Arabian Peninsula, hitting strategic targets, and not going for high body count, but just going for cutting off those critical points, so that we keep armies where they're least used, keep Turkish armies where they're least useful, while we so this was part of the kind of the mystique coming out of the First World War. I think there was some relationship between Churchill and Lawrence, and Churchill was championing weak point strategy, basically. And I mean, the Dardanelles and Gallipoli assault was a failure, but arguably it was a failure because of poor execution, not because the concept itself was poor. And Lawrence was advocating an invasion of Turkey, but at a different point, right? He wanted an invasion of Alexandretta, where the British Army might have been able to rely on support from Armenia and Armenians and Arabs, and this was prior to the Armenian genocide hitting its really so. But anyways, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, I guess. The point I want to get at is how much did some of that past history around pioneering of guerrilla warfare tactics in the First World War, as well as maybe tactics that had been used against the British in other places, how did that inform what happened in the Second World War?
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned Lawrence of Arabia, because when Colin Gubbins was instructed to really look into the whole idea of guerrilla warfare and produce this seminal work on really instructing people on how to carry out guerrilla attacks, he turned to Lawrence of Arabia, and he was Lawrence's. What Lawrence did in Arabia was incorporated into much of Colin Gubbins's thinking. He was one element. The other element, Colin Gubbins had been fighting in Northern Ireland. He'd a very desperate, nasty, violent, unpredictable war in Ireland. And he'd been there, and he'd seen Michael Collins and his band of Sinn Féin revolutionaries conducting hit-and-run tactics, using makeshift weaponry, highly effective and totally brutal. And Sinn Féin and Michael Collins became another sort of strand in his thinking of how to carry out unconventional attacks. So I think that what happened in the First World War and around that time was sort of plugged into Colin Gubbins's him being the architect of this new type of warfare in the Second World War, which was not necessarily new, but it used a lot of old ground, and he brought it all together to work out how best to carry out this on a wide scale.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it doesn't. I haven't been able to find it specifically in any of Lawrence's work, but in the movie, at least, the character who plays him makes this connection between guerrilla warfare and the practice of the British Navy throughout most of its history, which was there were other powers at different times that were stronger on land, but the British naval advantage allowed them to bring a great deal of strength to bear at critical points at critical times, and he makes the comparison between that and with the tactics they were trying to pursue in Arabia. So interesting the continuity there.
Just one thing, it's worth pointing out that many of the geniuses that Colin Gubbins brought on board had been in British India, and in particular, they'd been on the northwest frontier, which was a place where there was constant fighting taking place. And this is where a lot of them learned the tactics of guerrilla warfare, and the effectiveness of blowing up a bridge or a viaduct in highly mountainous and difficult terrain. You could cripple an army very easily, and they came back from India and brought these tactics, and these were all built into SOE's sort of operations in the war.
That's so interesting that you'd have people that were on the other side that then were kind of tactically switching over from the counter guerrilla warfare to engaging in guerrilla warfare. So this is interesting because now we should talk about today and the fact that you have this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's very asymmetrical in lots of different ways, because you have this you have a large army, right? Fighting against a large army with potential supply line issues coming from a very big country. geographically, and there may be morale and motivation issues, as well as what seems to have been a lack of awareness right up until the beginning of the conflict about what they were actually there for. On the other side, you have Ukraine with certain resource disadvantages, but an intense amount of motivation and real fervor driving a defense of familiar territory, their homeland. I don't think we know in terms of all the tactics that are being used, but there seem to be a lot of application of this desire to frustrate the invading army. Everything from small level sabotage to removing street signs. What are you seeing in the news out of what's happening in Ukraine that leads you to draw connections with some of the things you wrote about in this book?
I think you nailed it there in 2 words, and those 2 words are supply lines. This is a real challenge for the Russians, is that they are having to bring in supplies over long distances, and the Ukrainians have been absolutely brilliant in their guerrilla tactics and their sabotage tactics. So let me build on that by saying something like that. They've been taking out fuel dumps, fuel tankers, etc., blowing them out. So instead of attacking tanks, which, I mean, they have been taking out tanks, but instead of doing that, take out 4 or 5 tankers that are coming to refuel these tanks. If you destroy the fuel, those tanks aren't going anywhere. And a lot of your listeners will remember seeing those aerial shots of a backlog of tanks and jeeps and trucks and everything on that road north of Kiev. They were stuck there. They couldn't go anywhere because they didn't have any fuel. And so the Ukrainians have been targeting. It's very similar to what my guys were doing in the Second World War. They're taking out fuel depots. Look at that massive one that blew up the other day just over the border in Russia. They're taking out bridges and they're taking out railways, and they are stopping the Russians in their tracks. And it's relatively easy to take out these soft targets, and you can really cripple an army. And I think looking at what's happening, that the Russians are in big trouble, actually, because their supply lines, they're overstretched. They can't bring new stuff in, and the Ukrainians know what they're doing, and they're doing it hitherto. They're doing it exactly as it should be done.
Wow, that's very encouraging. So there's really, what you're suggesting is, if you've got a highly motivated population, they're doing this, they know how to do this, they're hitting those soft targets, they can just keep doing that, right? That the Russians are like, there's no thing they can figure out that will bring this to an end. I mean, I suppose they can devote more resources to trying to protect their supply lines, but that is more costly. And I guess I'm not looking for you to give them advice, but give us a sense of, that this can play out for a while then, in terms of the ability of the Ukrainians to stop stop further advances through obstructing supply lines.
I mean, look, to give one example from the Second World War, which is directly applicable, I think, all of the supplies for Rommel's Africa Corps, for the massive battle taking place in North Africa, they all came by train from Germany, down through Europe, through Greece, and then across the Mediterranean, shipped across the Mediterranean. The SOE guys in London, they looked at this railway line and they realized it passed through a very mountainous area in Greece. And in particular, it passed over one extremely vulnerable railway, a huge bridge that spanned a gorge. They took out that bridge, that viaduct, with an amazingly bold operation. They brought it down, and for 2 months, Rommel received no supplies at all at this crucial point in the campaign in North Africa. 2,000 trainloads of munitions did not arrive in North Africa because of this one viaduct that had been taken out. And so you could see from that the damage that can be done by hitting these supply lines and hitting them hard. And I think it's really interesting that the Ukrainians have been going for fuel, because this is something that the Russians are going to find it very, very difficult to get hold of any fuel when they're on Ukrainian territory. So they need to bring the fuel in. And these fuel dumps seem to be exploding all over the place with massive losses. And, you know, by doing that, you've stalled all the tanks. They can't go anywhere. I think they're carrying out classic sabotage tactics. And I mean, if I was a Russian commander, I'd be pretty worried at the way it's going. Even like you said, they've got massive numerical superiority, but they've got all sorts of issues with, you know, they're using conscripts, whereas they're up against highly motivated, you know, Ukrainians, with the West pouring in weapons into Ukraine now. So it's impossible to know how it will play out. But I think what happened north of Kiev could easily be replicated in the south and southeast of Ukraine as well.
Mm-hmm. And what's your sense of the technological innovation space as it relates to what's happening in Ukraine? I mean, you talked about, you know, your book talks about kind of those two different departments, the people doing the sabotage and the people developing weapons. Do you have a sense of innovations happening in weapons technology?
That I don't think so, because these soldiers are trained to use specific weapons, and I think it's no accident that the countries of, you know, Central Europe, Eastern Europe are shipping their old Soviet weaponry to the Ukraine. This is not, as some people have said, oh, they're just getting rid of their old weapons. I don't think that's entirely fair. I think these are weapons that the guys in Ukraine are trained to use. And so it makes perfect sense to take those out, because otherwise you've got to train people to use highly complex systems, you know, that you can't just learn this overnight. And also to fire some of these weapons, they require coordination from the air as well. So no, I think that's a big difference there between what happened in the Second World War with my guys and what's happening now. I think they're largely using the conventional weaponry they've got and they know how to use. Okay.
Giles, it's been a phenomenal conversation. One last question, kind of wrapping it all together in terms of moving forward. So does what's happening in Ukraine today suggest that, and I guess also what happened in Afghanistan, does it suggest that, well, I guess the question I'm thinking about is are we in this era of the great power or the era of the guerrilla? That is that, like, do large states actually have much ability to exercise power beyond their borders, or is it a practical reality that preserves and will preserve the system of independent nation states, that guerrilla warfare wins almost all the time?
Well, it's certainly looking like that in Ukraine. And I find it striking that you have to begin to wonder with sort of drone warfare whether the era of the tank is simply over. Because it seems, judging by all the films, the videos, the pictures I've seen, it seems relatively easy to take out a tank using a high-tech drone, you know. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think Ukraine is showing that guerrilla warfare is undergoing something of a renaissance at the moment. They're certainly stopping this highly mechanized army in its tracks. So where that leads the big players more in a sort of more global terms, I'm not sure, but I think warfare is changing before our very eyes.
Yeah. All right. Well, you've done a phenomenal job here at shedding some light on this history, and it's again, I cannot recommend the book any more highly. It's a phenomenal book, and I look forward to picking up your latest book and looking at some of the other things you've written. And look, this has huge strategic and political implications, right? How war is fought at a practical level obviously changes dynamics of power, and we're seeing that play out. And I think it's going to be really interesting for our listeners to reflect on some of the comparisons you've made between Second World War guerrilla warfare tactics used in continental Europe and what the Ukrainians are doing right now. Well, Giles, thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation, and a reminder to folks to leave a review, and we will be back with another episode in 7 days.